This is Walter Cronkite with the CBS Evening News. John Fitzgerald Kennedy was assassinated today in the 46th year of his life and his third year as President of the United States. These are the circumstances of the assassination. The President and Governor John Connally of Texas were shot while riding in the presidential limousine through the streets of Dallas. The President was shot once or twice through the head by a sniper firing from a 5th or 6th story window overlooking the motorcade route. They were rushed to a nearby hospital. The President died about half an hour later at 1 p.m. Dallas time. Governor Connally's condition is satisfactory. Both Mrs. Kennedy and Mrs. Connally were in the car. Neither was injured. Later in the afternoon, Dallas police arrested Lee H. Oswald, 24, a veteran of the leftist Fair Play for Cuba Committee, as a prime suspect. Oswald was dragged fighting and screaming from a Dallas movie theater. He also killed a Dallas police officer in that fight at the theater. Oswald went to Russia in 1959. He returned to this country only last year after failing in trying to get Soviet citizenship. Still pictures show the last dramatic moments of President Kennedy's life. The motorcade. This picture taken in the last minute before the shot was fired. You see in the back seat President Kennedy and Mrs. Kennedy. In the front seat, or in the jump seats of the special presidential motorcade car, Mrs. Connally and Governor Connally behind her. And this is a picture taken just a moment after the shooting. This is the car, and you see the Secret Service men riding in back of the car, looking over their shoulder to the right rear where the shot came from. This is a close-up of that same picture, and in this close-up you can see, in this position here, fairly you may see there the hands of the President apparently clutching Mrs. Kennedy. A moment later, she placed his bleeding head in her lap, and they drove rapidly to the hospital. This is a picture taken within an hour after the President's death aboard the jet airplane that brought now President Johnson back to Washington. Here he is taking the oath of office with Mrs. Johnson here and Mrs. Kennedy looking on. The judge giving the oath is Federal District Judge Sarah Hughes of Texas. At 3:39 this afternoon, Eastern Time, in that presidential jet parked at Dallas Airport, Lyndon Baines Johnson became the 36th President of the United States. The oath administered by Federal Judge Hughes, the first time it's ever been administered by a woman. Late this afternoon, the President's own plane brought his body, Mrs. Kennedy, and the new President back to Washington in company with now President Johnson. President Johnson arrived at Washington just a short while ago, as you just saw by videotape. He is now in the saddened White House. George Herman is standing by there. George Herman?
The word went out to the presidential White House guards here, to the Secret Service men. The President is in the White House. Only this time it was a different president, President Lyndon B. Johnson, led into the White House by the Secret Service men. This is symbolic of the new life Lyndon Johnson is going to lead. His every step guided by Secret Servicemen, his way pointed out for him, protocol, guarding, and making sure of every move that he makes. The President is in the White House. Across the street, crowds are watching the White House, hoping for a glimpse of their new President. There's a steady stream of people walking back and forth across the sidewalk. The police won't let them stop on this side of the street, but they walk back and forth, simply looking at the White House. And across the street, a large crowd has waited all afternoon. Now, the President is getting his first briefing as President, a briefing by Defense Secretary McNamara, by McGeorge Bundy, who was President Kennedy's National Security Advisor. A briefing on the world problems, the problems he faces from now on. The problems look different when you're President. You may remember that President Kennedy said after he took office at his first news conference that although he'd campaigned on facing up to the grim realities of the world today, he was astonished when he actually sat in the President's chair and faced those grim realities himself. Now, Defense Secretary McNamara and McGeorge Bundy are briefing him in such terms as mega deaths, White House and Pentagon shorthand for the millions of deaths which are now in the hands of President Lyndon Johnson in case there should be a thermonuclear exchange. The words death of Earth are being exchanged once again in a briefing of the President. that dose in a thermonuclear exchange which might lethally contaminate the atmosphere and kill all persons on Earth. Now the responsibility of a new man, President Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson must not only face up to the problems all over the world, to Vietnam, to Berlin, to all the problems which other presidents have faced and which fortunately for him are now somewhat in a lull. There's no immediate crisis there. He must face up to a problem which will be new and particularly frustrating to him, to the man who for so long led the Senate, led it as majority leader when there was a Republican, General Eisenhower, in the White House. He will find now, as President Truman and President Kennedy found before him, that a senator turned president is no longer a member of the club. He may have the sympathy and the friendship of the men on Capitol Hill, but no longer will they always do what he says when he asks. He must face the frustrations of closing out this particularly difficult, long-term, slow-moving session of the United States Congress, and closing it out with an election year facing him. The remaining business of the Congress is now the business of President Johnson. Then he has the problem of forming a new government. Theoretically, at least, the government of President Kennedy would now offer its resignation. The members of the cabinet were members who were loyal to and owed their allegiance to President Kennedy rather than to the United States as a whole. The members of the diplomatic staff, our ambassadors overseas, now will probably offer their resignations at least as a matter of protocol. The members of the White House staff, the aides who helped President Kennedy do his work, carrying on the business of the government, now also will offer their resignations. And Lyndon Johnson must look them all over. He must not only, in other words, pick up the threads of the government, but he must check out each thread, test it, and see if it fits his hand. Each thread must be checked to see whether this is the kind of man in the cabinet, in the White House staff, anywhere in the government, whether this is the kind of man that Lyndon Johnson can work with and wants to work with. He must check all the persons he'll have to work with on the Congress. He must take a new look, in other words, at his political friends, at his political opponents, and also, as other presidents have learned in the past to their sorrow, he must even take a new look at his friends. Because Lyndon Baines Johnson is now that totally new entity, the President of the United States. This is George Herman at the White House.
For a look at the beginning of President Kennedy's day in Texas, a day that began without even a hint of disaster. Here from Dallas is CBS News correspondent Dan Rather.
Since Kennedy's final 4 hours began this morning at Fort Worth's Carswell Air Force Base. He and Mrs. Kennedy had just attended a breakfast of the Fort Worth Chamber of Commerce. At the airport in Fort Worth, before taking off for Dallas, the Kennedys, as they have been prone to do all along on this Texas trip, went to the fence railing to shake hands with well-wishers and to allow some pictures to be taken. The President and Mrs. Kennedy both had looked particularly refreshed and rested yesterday during their trip to San Antonio and Houston, and again this morning as they started to leave Fort Worth. Democratic congressmen accompanying the President on his trip were right behind him and Mrs. Kennedy. And the two boarded Air Force One at Carswell Air Force Base for the 30-mile air trip from Fort Worth to Dallas. It had been a rather gray morning a little bit earlier in the day as a cold front moved across Texas, and there had been some rain. Laden skies and that little bit of rain were giving way to brilliant sunshine just about, an hour before the President's scheduled arrival time at Dallas's Love Field. This was the crowd at Love Field, a particularly large greeting crowd. It was described that way by Dallas police and Mayor Earl Cabell. It's ironic that the rain stopped before the President's arrival in Dallas. Had it continued raining, a bulletproof bubble top which fits over the sleek presidential convertible would have undoubtedly been used today and possibly would have prevented the assassination. But as the sunshine broke through, President and Mrs. Kennedy arrived in Dallas to be greeted by a line of local dignitaries. A very enthusiastic crowd was on hand. Local reporters who've covered many of these gatherings called it one of the largest airport greetings in Dallas history. Mrs. Kennedy was given a bouquet of roses. Mrs. Kennedy seemed to enjoy shaking hands with the local populace a bit more today than she did yesterday in San Antonio and Houston, when there were times yesterday when Mrs. Kennedy appeared to be a little ill at ease. This morning she was all smiles and very warm in her greetings, as was the President. Of course, the President used to such occasions. The President spent what seemed to be a rather long time at the Dallas airport making sure that he shook hands with everyone who was on hand there. As far as the dignitaries were concerned, always taking time, of course, to introduce his wife. Because of the rather long time spent at the airport, the President was a bit late getting started on his motorcade through downtown Dallas. They took time out at the airport to greet an elderly lady who said she had lived 69 years without shaking hands with the President. She got her chance today. The Secret Service, all during this Texas trip, had been allowing photographers and newsmen, local press, as distinguished from the White House news contingent, to work very closely around the President and Mrs. Kennedy. The presidential couple went again to the fence railing in Dallas to greet the well-wishers, departing from the course marked out for them by Secret Service people. But of course, President Kennedy had made something of a reputation as a man who liked to break away and shake hands with well-wishers and the crowds who gathered to see him. These are some of the last close-up pictures taken of President Kennedy. He was literally mobbed as he and Mrs. Kennedy went to that fence railing at Love Field. The crowd at the Dallas airport was, to a large measure, a young crowd. The teenage group, which played such a prominent role in President Kennedy's 1960 campaign. Youngsters of the teen age were very much in abundance at the airport. Mrs. Kennedy carried with her the entire time at the airport the roses that had been given to her. Then the presidential couple entered the open Lincoln convertible in which they rode with Governor and Mrs. John Connally. Of course, Governor Connally also was shot in the convertible. In the convertible, 2 Secret Service agents driving it. Immediately behind them, Governor and Mrs. John Connally of Texas. And then in the rear seat, the President and Mrs. Kennedy. The plan in Dallas was to go from the airport with a rather slow motorcade so that everyone would have a chance to look, applaud, and take pictures of the President and Mrs. Kennedy. To go along Lemon Street, which is one of Dallas's main streets, then cut over to Main Street, and go down to Main Street after circling through the downtown area out to the Trade Mart, where the President was due to make a speech. This is the convertible which the President was riding when he was shot. Now, this is one of the overhead walkways and railroad trestles under which the presidential car had to go. At first, it was thought that the assassin's bullet might have been fired from one of those walkways or railroad trestles. But the current most popular theory is that the assassin's bullet was fired from the upper story of a building. This was the scene in downtown Dallas as the presidential motorcade went rather slowly by. As you can see, the crowd is 10, 12, and 14 lines deep. It was variously estimated that between 200 and 300,000 persons had turned out to greet President Kennedy. Down the Main Street Canyon of Dallas, President riding in an open-top convertible, he and Mrs. Kennedy frequently looking up to wave to persons who took positions in the high buildings. As you can see, the welcome was enthusiastic and warm. It was from this kind of window that the assassin's bullet is believed to have been fired, although these particular pictures are further downtown than the scene where the actual shooting took place. Then the shots rang out. The presidential motorcade speeded up. The president was rushed immediately to Parkland Hospital. This is the rear entrance to the hospital, through which the president's car was brought. There are the roses Mrs. Kennedy had been carrying. They were on the floor. They had gotten there in the car as Mrs. Kennedy put the head of her mortally wounded husband on her lap. This is the interior of the convertible. Dallas law enforcement officers and Secret Service men, along with Congressman Jim Wright, Democratic Senator Ralph Yarborough, were all on hand at the rear of the hospital. The law enforcement people and the Secret Service men kept photographers, newsmen, and the curious as far away from the rear of the hospital as they possibly could. Congressman Wright there in a moment of grief. A large crowd gathered at Parkland Hospital as word spread that the president had been shot. There was considerable disbelief at first that he had actually been shot. Some thought he simply had taken ill. This is the new and modern Parkland Hospital with some of the best facilities in this part of the country, to which the president was taken after he was shot. This is the ambulance that carried the president in, moving away. A tight security guard was placed around the automobile. There are some of the aides and one or two doctors, I believe, rushing into the hospital. Senator Ralph Yarborough, who was one of the last to see President Kennedy arrive, gave reporters some early details. These were long moments at Parkland Hospital as everyone waited for word on how is the president. Hospital sources gave this report of the arrival at the emergency entrance to the hospital, and I quote from the hospital: "The president was lying motionless in the car. Mrs. Kennedy was leaning over him, holding him. Governor Connolly was leaning back in the seat, holding his stomach. Both men were covered with blood. Inside the emergency room, witnesses said the First Lady, splattered with blood, entered without a word. Mrs. Kennedy reportedly held up very well inside. She was heard only to say, 'Jack, Jack, no, no.' Even regular hospital attendants were barred admittance to the emergency room as a bevy of doctors worked frantically over President Kennedy. At the same time this scene was going on at Parkland Hospital, all around town, police, sheriff's deputies, and Secret Service men were following every possible lead, every possible clue in an effort to come up with some kind of lead to the assassin. Governor Yarborough, after checking inside in the emergency room, came out and told reporters that he simply didn't know whether the president was still alive or not. The Washington press corps and newsmen in general were, of course, pressing for some kind of word, some kind of detail. Things began to get crowded despite police efforts there at the rear of the hospital, the emergency room. At the moment these pictures were taken, it was known that the president was in serious, perhaps critical condition. It was not known that he was dead. All around the hospital, the faces of the crowd that gathered told the story. This is part of the motor entourage which I believe brought two Roman Catholic Church priests to the hospital. The crowd now has gotten the word. The word has been received that President Kennedy is dead. There were some others wounded at the scene of the shooting. They were brought in much later. Very shortly after it was announced that the president had died, A local ambulance pulled up to the hospital, and about the time it did arrive to carry the body of President Kennedy away, Presidential Press Assistant Malcolm Kilduff held a press briefing and made the announcement that the president was officially dead. He also explained the seating arrangement in the automobile in which the president had taken part in the motorcade along with Governor and Mrs. John Connally. This was a seating arrangement: the Secret Service, 2 Secret Service men in front, the Connollys in the middle, the President and Mrs. Kennedy in the rear. President Kennedy was sitting on the right-hand side as you looked onto that car from the top side. The shot apparently was fired from about 1 block away from what is believed to have been a .30 caliber weapon. The crowd outside the hospital got larger about the time the presidential party and the body of President Kennedy left Dallas's Parkland Hospital. Police continued to stand guard over the convertible which had brought the blood-splattered Mr. Kennedy and Mr. Connally to the hospital. The latest word on Governor Connally is that he is in serious but not critical condition. Here it is being explained to some members of the crowd that they have to get further back. Here are some grief-stricken members of the presidential party. Mrs. Kennedy rode out in an ambulance. The curtains drawn. The body was taken immediately to Dallas's Love Field, where it was put aboard the presidential plane, Presidential One. Here is the Roman Catholic father who administered the last rites, Oscar Huber, Father Oscar Huber of Holy Trinity Church in Dallas, and one of the other fathers at Holy Trinity Church. They were the 2 Catholic priests who administered the last rites. There were stares of disbelief as the body of the president rode away. All afternoon, many Dallasites kept saying it just can't be true. Mayor Earl Cabell as he rushed away from the hospital. The President's personal secretary and Mrs. Kennedy's secretary leaving the hospital at about the time the body left. The ambulance that carried the body of President Kennedy out to the airport. The motorcade, of course, was very small. The ambulance, 3 cars, and some police motorcycle escorts. It was a bronze coffin in which the body of the president was placed inside that ambulance. Police, in the meantime, had ringed a building from which the shots were believed to have been fired. This is the building about a block from Houston and Main in Dallas. Police had heard reports that a man with a gun had been seen on the 4th or 5th floor of that building, so they immediately circled the building, heavily armed police and sheriff's deputies, and an inch-by-inch, foot-by-foot search was made of the building and also of the surrounding neighborhood. A number of suspects were picked up in the early minutes after the shooting. Some of those picked up were simply people officers thought might have some information on the shooting, not people that the police thought actually did the shooting. For about a half an hour, law enforcement officers thought they might have the assassin trapped in the building. One employee of the building was later picked up as a suspect and is still in custody. At the time these pictures were filmed. The police thought they might have the assassin still inside that building. As mentioned earlier, not only the building, but a 3 or 4 block area was sealed off. From one of those open windows, perhaps came the shot that killed President Kennedy. At least 6 and possibly as many as 12 arrests were made in the confusion and frantic searching that followed the shooting. This warehouse building is located a block from the Houston and Main intersection where the president was shot. This is the motorcade route area. This is the kind of neighborhood in which the shooting occurred. Police and detectives here are chasing some other people that they wanted for questioning in connection with the shooting. Then downtown at a theater, police arrested a man after a Dallas policeman was shot. The man was brought immediately to police headquarters, as were all of those arrested. That man said to have been an employee of the building from which the shot is believed to have come. Let me emphasize that no charges have been filed against anyone in connection with the case. This is Judge Sarah T. Hughes, a woman, federal district judge. She is the woman who gave the oath of office to now President Lyndon Johnson after the shooting of President Kennedy. Judge Sarah T. Hughes here is going directly to the plane at Love Field where the presidential oath was administered to Lyndon Johnson. This is the plane carrying the body of President Kennedy from Dallas to Washington. The final speech of President John Fitzgerald Kennedy was made this morning to a breakfast meeting of the Fort Worth Chamber of Commerce. This was that speech.
The United States. I know now why everyone in Texas, Fort Worth, is so thin, having gotten up and down about 9 times. This is what you do every morning. Mr. Buck, Mr. Vice President, Governor Conley, Senator Yarborough, Jim Wright, members of the congressional delegation, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Attorney General, ladies and gentlemen. 2 years ago, I said that, introduced myself in Paris by saying that I was the man who had accompanied Mrs. Kennedy to Paris. I'm getting somewhat that same sensation as I travel around Texas. Nobody wonders what Lyndon and I wear. I'm glad to be here in Jim Wright City. About 35 years ago, a congressman from California, just been elected, received a letter from an irate constituent which said, During your campaign, you promised to have the Sierra Madre Mountains reforested. You've been in office for 1 month and you haven't done so. Well, no one in Fort Worth has been that unreasonable, but in some ways he has had the Sierra Madre Mountains reforested. And here in Fort Worth, he's contributed to its growth. He speaks for Fort Worth. He speaks for the country. And I don't know any city that's better represented in the Congress of the United States than Fort Worth. And if there are any Democrats here this morning, I'm sure you won't hold that against them. 3 years ago, last September, I came here on the Vice President and spoke at Burke Burnett Park. I called in that speech for a national security policy and a national security system which was second to none. A position which said not first but, if, when, and how, but first. That city responded to that call as it has through its history. And we have been putting that pledge into practice ever since. And I want to say a word about that pledge here in Fort Worth, which understands national defense and its importance to the security of the United States. During the days of the Indian War, this city was a fort. During the days of World War I, even before the United States got into the war, Royal Canadian Air Force pilots were training here. During the days of World War II, the great Liberator bombers, on which my brother flew with his co-pilot from this city, were produced here. First non-stop flight around the world took off and returned here in a plane built in factories here. The first truly intercontinental bomber, the B-36, was produced here. The B-58, which is the finest weapon system in the world today, which it demonstrated most recently in flying from Tokyo to London with an average speed of nearly 1,000 miles per hour, is a Fort Worth project. The Iroquois helicopter from Fort Worth is a mainstay in our fight against the guerrillas in South Vietnam. The transportation of crews between our missile sites is done in planes produced here in Fort Worth. So wherever the confrontation may occur, and in the last 3 years it's occurred at least 3 occasions, in Laos, in Berlin, and in Cuba, and it will again. Wherever it occurs, the products of Fort Worth and the men of Fort Worth provide us with a sense of security. And in the not too distant future, a new Fort Worth product. And I'm glad that there was a table separating Mr. Hicks and myself. A new Fort Worth product. The TFX, Tactical Fighter Experimental. Nobody knows what those words mean, but that's what they mean. Tactical Fighter Experimental will serve the forces of freedom and will be the #1 airplane in the world today. There's been a good deal of discussion of the long and hard-fought competition to win the TFX contract, but very little discussion about what this plane will do. It will be the first operational aircraft ever produced that can literally spread its wings through the air. It will thus give us a single plane capable of carrying out missions of speed as well as distance, able to fly very far in one form or very fast in another. It can take off from rugged, short airstrips, enormously increasing the Air Force's ability to participate in limited wars. The same basic plane will serve the Navy's carriers, saving the taxpayers at least $1 billion in cost if they built separate planes for the Navy and the Air Force. The government of Australia, by purchasing $125 million of TFX planes before they are even off the drawing boards, has already testified to the merit of this plane, and at the same time, it's confident in the ability of Fort Worth to meet its schedule. In all these ways, the success of our national defense depends upon this city in the western United States, 10,000 miles from Vietnam, 5,000 or 6,000 miles from Berlin, thousands of miles from trouble spots in Latin America and Africa or the Middle East. And yet Fort Worth and what it does and what it produces participates in all these great historic events. Texas as a whole and Fort Worth bear particular responsibility for this national defense effort. For military procurement in this state totals nearly $1.25 billion, fifth highest among all the states of the Union. There are more military personnel on active duty in this state than any in the nation save one. And it's not Massachusetts. Any in the nation save one with a combined military-civilian defense payroll of well over $1 billion. I don't recite these for any partisan purpose. They're the result of American determination to be second to none. And as a result of the effort which this country has made in the last 3 years, we are second to none. In the past 3 years, we have increased the defense budget of the United States by over 20%, increased the program of acquisition for Polaris submarines from 24 to 41, increased our Minuteman missile purchase program by more than 75%, doubled the number of strategic bombers and missiles on alert, doubled the number of nuclear weapons available in the strategic alert forces, increased the tactical nuclear forces deployed in Western Europe by over 60%, added 5 combat-ready divisions to the armies of the United States, and 5 tactical fighter wings to the Air Force of the United States, increased our strategic airlift capability by 75%, and increased our special counterinsurgency forces, which are engaged now in South Vietnam, by 600%. I hope those who want a strong America and place it on some signs will also place those figures next to it. This is not an easy effort. This requires sacrifice by the people of the United States. But this is a very dangerous and uncertain world. As I said earlier, on 3 occasions in the last 3 years, the United States has had a direct confrontation. No one can say when it will come again. No one expects that our life will be easy. Certainly not in this decade, and perhaps not in this century. But we should realize what a burden and responsibility the people of the United States have borne for so many years. Here, a country which lived in isolation, divided and protected by the Atlantic and the Pacific, uninterested in the struggles of the world around it. Here, in the short space of 18 years after the Second World War, we put ourselves by our own will and by necessity into defensive alliances with countries all around the globe. Without the United States, South Vietnam would collapse overnight. Without the United States, the SEATO alliance would collapse overnight. Without the United States, the CENTO alliance would collapse overnight. Without the United States, there would be no NATO, and gradually Europe would drift into neutralism and indifference. Without the effort of the United States and the Alliance for Progress, the communist advance onto the mainland of South America would long ago have taken place. So this country, which desires only to be free, which desires to be secure, which desires to live at peace for 18 years under 3 different administrations, has borne more than its share of the burden, has stood watch for more than its number of years. I don't think that we are fatigued or tired. We would like to live as we once lived, but history will not permit it. The communist balance of power is still strong. The balance of power is still on the side of freedom. We are still the keystone and the arch of freedom, and I think we will continue to do as we have done in our past, our duty, and the people of Texas will be in the lead. So I'm glad to come. I'm glad to come to this state, which has played such a significant role in so many efforts in this century, and to say that here in Fort Worth, you people will be playing a major role in the maintenance of the security of the United States for the next 10 years. I'm confident, as I look to the future, that our chances for security, our chances for peace, are better than they've been in the past. And the reason is because we're stronger. And with that strength is a determination to not only maintain the peace, but also the vital interests of the United States. To that great cause, Texas and the United States are committed. Thank you.
Mr. President, your visit with us in Fort Worth today, the things you have said have refreshed and renewed our appreciation of your great leadership and courage. You have brought rain to moisten our pastures and our fields. You have brought sunshine in our hearts. We know that you don't wear a hat. We couldn't let you leave Fort Worth without providing you with some protection against the rain.
Put it on in the White House on Monday. If you'll come up there, you'll have a chance to see it there.
That Texas hat is presented to you by Washer Brothers, one of the oldest men's stores in Texas. And to protect you against local enemies, in the manner that you are protecting this nation against our foreign enemies, and to keep the rattlesnakes on Vice President Johnson's ranch from striking you, we want to present this pair of boots. We won't ask you to put them on. Here. The boots are presented by Mr. John Justin, former mayor of Fort Worth, manufacturer of the most walked-about boots in the world. And Mrs. Kennedy, as you ride to the hounds or walk to the rattlesnakes, we want you to have protection too. Before the benediction, I'd like to present Mrs. Granville Walker, the wife of Dr. Granville Walker, who will pronounce the benediction, Mrs. Granville Walker. After Dr. Walker gives the benediction, we ask that you please remain seated until the President and Mrs. Kennedy have made their exit. Dr. Granville Walker.
Let us be in the spirit of prayer. The Lord bless all nations with a desire for peace. The Lord bless our own beloved nation with rectitude and prosperity, and grant us to achieve justice for all within it. The Lord bless our President and all in places of responsibility with wisdom and with health equal to their tasks. And now the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and be gracious unto you. The Lord cause his face to shine upon you and give you peace both now and forever. Amen.
Lee H. Oswald, the 24-year-old man whom Dallas police say is a prime suspect in the assassination of President Kennedy, was questioned for 6 hours at the Dallas police station this evening. He was arrested shortly after the assassination and has been under questioning ever since. But as he was led from the interrogation room upstairs in the Dallas police station, perhaps reporters say for booking, he said to reporters, "I don't know anything about this. I haven't done anything." Apparently, he is still denying any knowledge of the assassination. Oswald's arrest resulted from a theater cashier's tip, Mrs. Julie Postal telephoning police from the Texas Theater that a man inside looked like he was running from someone. And that was just 45 minutes after the shooting, the theater 3 miles away from the shooting scene. She said he kept changing seats in the theater. The police, by this time, were frantically searching the city for the killer, of course, and 2 officers raced to the theater and in through a rear door. One of them opened fire. Oswald had a snub-nosed .38 pistol on him, and he shot 2. It's not clear who fired first, but Officer J.D. Tippett was shot dead, and police say that Oswald's pistol killed him. Oswald, as we said, was local chairman of the pro-Castro Fair Play for Cuba Committee. He went to Russia in 1959, saying he was relinquishing his United States citizenship. He returned last year, complaining that he was disillusioned. Whether or not he ever actually did get Soviet citizenship is not clear, but he did marry while in Russia and is said to have 1 or 2 children. His wife is in this country with him and was taken to the police station this afternoon also. Oswald worked in the building where the murder weapon, a German-made Mauser rifle, was discovered. Oswald has been active in propaganda activities, as Bob Jones from station WWL-TV in New Orleans reports.
This is Lee H. Oswald, October 16th in New Orleans, when he was handing out handbills for the Fair Play for Cuba Committee in front of the International Trade Mart. New Orleans police know Oswald well. On August 9th, he was arrested for disturbing the peace by creating a scene on the city's main Canal Street by also distributing these handbills. He resided in an apartment here from May 9th until August 20th, when he slipped out in the middle of the night without having paid his rent. The apartment manager said he was quiet and talked to no one. They found several of these pamphlets lying around the apartment after he had left. This is Bob Jones, WWL-TV in New Orleans.
By strange coincidence, since 1840, beginning with Benjamin Harrison, over our last 8 presidents who assumed office on the even years, 2 decades apart, have died in office. And of the nation's 35 presidents, 4 have died of assassins' bullets. President Lincoln in 1865, Garfield in 1881, McKinley in 1901, and John F. Kennedy today. In this century, 4 vice presidents have moved up to the highest office in emergencies. Theodore Roosevelt succeeded President McKinley. Calvin Coolidge in August 1923 succeeded Warren Harding, who died of a stroke. In April 1945, Harry Truman took the oath of office following Franklin Roosevelt's death at Warm Springs, Georgia. And today, Lyndon Johnson took the oath aboard an Air Force jetliner at Dallas, Texas. For a report on the man who is our new president, here is Eric Severin. Walter, on this day of misfortune, perhaps some measure of comfort can be taken from one circumstance. This time, the successor to an assassinated president is a man of first-rank ability. This was not so when Abraham Lincoln died, although some historians disagree about Andrew Johnson. It was not so when Garfield died and was succeeded by Chester Arthur. It was so when McKinley died and Theodore Roosevelt became the president. And it's so again. Lyndon Baines Johnson is no throttle bottom, no political accident. He is 55 years old. He's in the prime of life for the responsibilities of the presidency, at a point where a man's experience and his energies meet at a high mutual level. Johnson was born in Texas near the hamlet called Johnson City, where the family flag flies over the LBJ Ranch. He's a lawyer by education, a politician by instinct, and by great success. He was a very young aide to Franklin Roosevelt during the New Deal days. He worked on the youth projects. He first went to the House of Representatives in 1937. He was only 29 years old. And there in the House, he became the personal protege of Sam Rayburn, the great Texan who ran the House as Speaker longer than any man in our history, including Henry Clay. Johnson went to the Senate in 1949, winning in Texas by a tiny majority of just 87 votes. And he became, without much doubt, the most effective majority leader in the whole story of the Senate. His energy there was prodigious. He lived in a whirl of activity. He put most senators in his personal debt by one kind of service or another. His fame became great in Washington itself during the years of Republican rule under President Eisenhower. His power then as Senate leader was greater by far than it has been since in the vice presidency. Johnson was called a liberal by instinct and intellect, a conservative by geography. His political alliances in Texas were with the more conservative Texans who have managed that state for a good many years. But in most national matters, he was regarded as progressive, including on the matter of civil rights. Again, this was in the pattern and the image of his patron, Sam Rayburn. He is a fairly wealthy man. His family holdings, some in the name of his wife, Lady Bird, include television stations as well as the ranch. In 1955, when Johnson was making a visit to the Virginia farm of Mr. George McGee, another Texan, now ambassador to Germany, Mr. Johnson felt ill. He thought it was acute indigestion. Senator Clinton Anderson of New Mexico was present, and he said at once, "You're having a heart attack." Johnson was taken to a hospital where he slowly recovered. For some time after that, his strength was diminished. He told reporters once, "On Monday mornings, I'm full of fire. By Wednesday night, I'm all tired out." But all this changed. His full strength came back, and in recent years, he has demonstrated his old energies in a daily whirl of activities, including a great many trips around this country and abroad. He is now personally acquainted with virtually all the world leaders that President Kennedy was acquainted with, including Mr. Khrushchev. His grasp of domestic politics is very great, at the general and intellectual level, and at the practical working level of the total human machinery that makes our rather cumbrous system work. His fierce fight against Mr. Kennedy for the Democratic nomination in 1960 seems only yesterday. But his great prestige in Washington at that time was not matched by his prestige in the country at large. So it was a tremendous struggle right down to the final hours of the convention. Mr. Kennedy chose Johnson to be his running mate, partly because he had to have strength in the southern states. Johnson was the one man who could conciliate the southern conservatives, and this he did. In fact, there were many later on who said that Mr. Kennedy owed his election to Mr. Johnson. In any case, Johnson became the president's lieutenant in full fidelity, not only in his public actions, but in his private talk. But he began to fade from the national consciousness as vice president, as most vice presidents under an energetic president are bound to do. When the president, President Kennedy, died today, both he and the vice president were engaged behind the scenes in trying to settle the feud within the Texas Democratic Party between the Johnson-Connally forces and the liberal forces led by Senator Ralph Yarborough. And now all that, which does seem so petty in retrospect, all that doesn't matter very much. Mr. Johnson is the president. Texas is his personal political base in its totality. Now, when the sorrow of today begins to fade and when the president has been laid to rest, the machinery of the national government will take up again, and again Americans will think ahead, not only as to what lines of policy and action the new president will follow, but
also after a while to the election of next year. Mr. Johnson will be nominated at the Democratic Convention next August if he wishes it, and I think most observers tonight would predict that he will wish it. All estimations as to the outcome of the election itself a year from this November, of course, are right now without meaning. That election, like the course of this great country itself, lies with fate and with the continuing nature of the times and of the world itself. Now, Walter.
Dallas, Texas, a name and a place that bore the romance of the great oil state and its almost legendary wealth. In an instant, in the flash of an assassin's bullet, has been saddled with an unwanted memory. The mayor of Dallas is Earl Cabell. He is with Eddie Barker in our KRLD TV studios in Dallas right now.
Walter, I think that most Dallasites feel at this hour, as I do, still in a state of shock. But as the grim reality takes hold that in our town, the President of the United States could be gunned down by a fiend, I shudder and feel sick in the pit of my stomach. And Dallas feels that way, too. Because, you know, Dallas is not that kind of town. To Easterners who come here, they often say, well, this is sort of a little New York. It's known as the town in the Southwest with the culture. It's had a lot of problems with its extreme elements, but this is something today that certainly has this town shocked. Mayor Earl Cabell, who was in that presidential parade today and was only a car's length away when the president was shot. Mayor?
Eddie, what you say about Dallas is true. Dallas has been proud, and it has been known as a friendly, as a gracious city. And that is what has added so much to the shock of what happened today. Along 12 or 14 miles of the route of the caravan, the parade, it was so obvious, the friendliness, the warmth, that was just coming from all of those people. Never in all of my life, and I've lived in Dallas all of my life, I've ridden in dozens of parades, but never have I seen such multitudes, such thousands on the street. And never have I seen such enthusiasm, such warmth that expressed themselves and that was so spontaneous as the cars passed. And then almost at the end of that route, for those shots to ring out, and with the realization as to what was going on, even before we realized what had actually happened. Eddie, the shock of it is just unbelievable. And it hadn't been 2 minutes prior to that we had been talking to Congressman Roberts of McKinney of this tremendous ovation that had greeted the president. And then, of course, the rest is history.
Mayor, we've had some bad light shed on this city of ours in the past few weeks. What with the incident here not too long ago when Adlai Stevenson was hit with a sign and spat upon, and now the president of the country is assassinated here. What is Dallas going to do?
Well, I cannot ascribe that to being the feeling of the true Dallas citizen or the preponderance of Dallas citizens. Those people represent only a handful of the radical right, and I don't ascribe criminal tendencies to them. Possibly they might have incited a lower grade of brain to have committed an act like this, but I can't point my finger. This is no time to point fingers. This is a time of prayer and sober reflection. We all have to search our souls with reference to what we might have said or done to have brought about a calamity of this sort.
Mayor, I would think that the feeling is that in the broad moral sense at least, that all of us share in what has happened here today, but this city, as you say, is not a city where things like this are done. The minority, it's a loud one, and today, this tragic thing that happens really once in a lifetime.
This is a guilt that doesn't belong to a few. This is a guilt of the nation. We're all responsible for this.
For the reaction of some Dallasites, here is CBS newsman Nelson Benton.
This is the corner of Elm and Eckerd Street in Dallas, Texas, late afternoon. And these are average citizens of Dallas, Texas. Could we ask your reaction to the president's death today?
Well, we were just horrified when we heard that. We couldn't believe that he had been shot. I heard we were working, and someone came in and told us that the president had been shot, and we just didn't believe him. That we didn't think that anything like that could happen.
Is this your wife?
Yes, it is.
May I ask you, what was your reaction?
I just couldn't believe it. I had only seen him just moments before, alive, and then...
You watched the parade?
Yes, I did. It was horrible.
How do you think the city of Dallas feels about it?
I think they think it's horrible.
Everyone I've talked to is just... They just can't believe anything like this could have happened here.
Didn't believe it at first. They came down there at the bank and telling us, and we just didn't believe it because we just walked down just a few minutes before it happened.
You were at work at the time?
Yes, I was at work at the time, so I couldn't believe it.
What was the reaction among the people at the bank?
Well, none of us could believe it until we got phone calls from our friends and relatives and everything, hearing it on the radio and then telling us, and then we came to realize that it had happened. We just couldn't believe it.
Thank you very much. Could I talk to you a moment, ma'am? What is your reaction to the tragic event that occurred here today?
I can't believe it. I just can't believe it.
Where were you when you heard about it?
I was at work.
Had you seen the parade?
No, we hadn't gone down.
How did you hear about it?
One of a department head from another department came in and said that President Kennedy was dead, and none of us, we just couldn't believe it.
Well, when I heard the news, I was so stunned, and it just shocked, and I'm still nervous. We lost a good man.
In Havana, the Havana radio is reporting the assassination of the president without comment. The announcers appear to be reading a straight copy from the press service wires. They do report that the prime suspect, Lee Oswald, was chairman of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, but they're making no comment on that fact. In Washington, the death of the president seemed as if someone had pulled the keystone out of the firm arch of government. For reaction from the nation's capital, here is Roger Mudd.
In the past 97 years, Washington has been shocked by the assassination of 3 presidents. But today, in this era of instantaneous communication, the news of John Kennedy's death struck so suddenly here it felled this city as if she had been hit in the solar plexus. On the Senate floor, a young Republican from Kansas whispered blankly, "I feel sick at my stomach." The only word Albert Gore of Tennessee could utter was horrible. Hubert Humphrey issued a public statement, but then later told his office staff, "I can't contain myself. I feel the loss of a part of my own life." Aside from President Johnson, probably no elected official in Washington was more deeply affected than the Speaker of the House, John McCormick of Massachusetts. Speaker McCormick, the 72-year-old Democrat from South Boston, tonight stands directly behind Lyndon Johnson in succession to the presidency.
The tragic death of President Kennedy is a great loss, not only to our country, but to the entire world. President Kennedy was giving to our country and to the free world visionary, sterling, and courageous leadership so necessary during this trying period of the world's history. The bullet of the assassin has taken from our midst one of the great Americans of all time. The world, in addition to our country, the people of our country will mourn not only the passing of this great man, but the dastardly manner in which his death took place. I have lost a dear and personal friend, and I and Mrs. McCormick, with the rest of the people of the nation, mourn the passing of our great president and our outstanding leader. I know that all Americans join with me and Mrs. McCormick in extending to Mrs. Kennedy and the other loved ones of the family of our late president our deepest sympathy in their bereavement. While he has left us, he takes his place in history. And I know that if he could speak to us from the great beyond, that he would say to you and I, all Americans, whether we occupy official life or not, carry on and see that your children and your children's children live under the same form of government that we have today. So from the sacrifices, the leadership, the dedicated service of President Kennedy, let us renew our confidence in the future of our country. Let us renew our love of our country, and let us go forth determined to follow the spirit of President Kennedy with faith and with confidence, meeting all challenges and all obstacles that might occur, and to lead us through the leadership, his spirit, the spirit of President Kennedy and the leadership of President Johnson, to a world of peace.
The first report of the shooting of the president reached the Capitol Hill this afternoon shortly before 2 o'clock. The House was not in session, but the Senate was, considering routine business. Presiding was the president's younger brother, Senator Edward Kennedy, one of half a dozen freshman Democrats who take turns in the presiding officer's chair. The call for a quorum had been issued, and the roll was being read when Richard Riddell, a Senate employee who serves as press liaison, spotted the first bulletin from Dallas on the news ticker in the lobby behind the Senate chamber.
I immediately went into the Senate chamber in front of the desk of Majority Leader Senator Mike Mansfield, raised my voice so that he and the senators, the surrounding desk, could hear, and said, "Senators, the president has been shot." It, of course, was like a shock wave, a jolt. I crossed the aisle to the Republican side, where Senator Dirksen was seated, and in the same manner told Senator Dirksen and the Republican senators who were at adjacent desks, with, of course, the same shocked reaction and stunned expression on their faces. I then happened to recall that a few moments before, the president's brother, Senator Edward Kennedy of Massachusetts, was presiding over the Senate. I turned and he was still occupying the chair. I knew that someone would have to inform him, and I thought I might as well. It was a very difficult job because of the family relationship as well as the friendship of the senators to the president. I rushed up to the chair and said, Senator Kennedy, your brother, the president, has been shot." He gave a jerk to his body tensed, but he was absolutely calm. And as I recall, Senator Kennedy, then presiding over the Senate, when he heard this awful news, said no. And that was all.
Senator Kennedy then left the Capitol immediately, went directly to Andrews Field, and with his sister, Mrs. Sergeant Shriver, flew to Hyannisport, Massachusetts, to be with their parents. On the Senate floor, it was 1:55. Majority Leader Mansfield suspended the quorum call and recessed the Senate to await the call of the chair. Mansfield and Minority Leader Dirksen then called the White House and stayed in touch with the White House until there was official confirmation that the president had indeed been shot. Mansfield then recalled the Senate, and Chaplain Frederick Brown Harris offered a prayer, and the Senate adjourned until noon Monday. But not really. The Senate just stood there, bewildered, aghast, and dumbfounded. Around those news tickers in the lobby stood some of the most powerful senators in Washington, listening as Richard Russell of Georgia read aloud to them each word from Dallas as it was laid down by the teletype. Finally, the bulletin that seemed blacker than all the others started moving. President Kennedy is dead. The news, of course, brought this nation of ours almost to a standstill. The stock market closed shortly after the news, after stocks had dropped precipitously, with the greatest drop since Black Monday of the stock market crash. Throughout the country, theaters closed. And in Times Square, the heart of the amusement industry in the United States, that great street of Broadway is almost dark tonight. Bernard Eisman is there. Come in, Bernard.
Broadway is not the Great White Way tonight. All of the lights on the spectacular advertising displays have been dimmed, put out. The movie houses with their flickering, twinkling banks of neon, they too have doused their lights and closed their box offices. In the streets off Broadway, the score of legitimate theaters with plays on the boards, those that are successful and those are not, they too are closed. Even the little Frankfurter stands here and there are closing down. As evening came, Broadway paid its tribute to the president. It went dark, something it hasn't done in the memory of very many people. Even the crowds and the traffic on Broadway are unusually light. The automobile traffic is not a tenth of what it would be on any ordinary weekend night. And the crowds walking the streets, they too are very light. Usually, here it's elbow to elbow and knee to knee as people fight to get from one amusement palace to another. Not so tonight. Now, they carry little radios and listen for more news of the president's death, or they read newspapers whose glaring headlines brings home the reality of a tragedy. This is Bernard Eisman on a very dark and dim Broadway.
Let's go now back to Washington, to the White House, and to George Herman.
The White House of the United States is empty. President Lyndon Johnson is working in the office he occupied across the street, the Executive Office Building, the office of the Vice President of the United States. Mrs. Kennedy is not coming back to the White House at all. Her children left the White House at 5:30 this afternoon, presumably to join Mrs. Kennedy, who is going into seclusion. President Johnson has talked to former President Truman and to former President Eisenhower, both of whom have apparently indicated that they will be here for the viewing of the president's body tomorrow. President Hoover apparently is not going to be able to make it. President Johnson met with McGeorge Bundy, President Kennedy's aide on national security matters, with Secretary of Defense McNamara, and with Undersecretary of State George Bull for his first briefing as President of the United States. As I say, he's working now in his Executive Office Building office. The President also met with the legislative leaders of both houses of Congress and both parties. He asked for their united support in this tragedy which has befallen the country. He said it's more essential than ever that this country be united, and he asked them to help with the help of God for them all. This is George Herman at the White House. Back now to Walter Cronkite.
Mr. Kennedy's parents, Joseph and Rose Kennedy, are in seclusion tonight at their Hyannisport, Massachusetts home. They learned of the news of the assassination of their son from a workman at the house who heard it over the radio, and they immediately went into that seclusion. Attorney General Robert Kennedy, the president's younger brother and his closest advisor, was having lunch at his Washington home when the tragic news reached him. The president's other brother, Senator Edward Kennedy, was presiding over the Senate. When word of the assassination reached him, he rushed out of the Senate chamber, and he and his sister, Mrs. Eunice Shriver, later flew to Hyannisport to be with their parents. Another sister, Mrs. Patricia Lawford, was placed under a doctor's care at her home in Santa Monica, California, after receiving word of the assassination. Next week was to have been a big one for the Kennedy family, particularly for Caroline, who will be 6 years old on Wednesday, and for John Jr., who observes his third birthday on Monday. John, as the president called him, was to have been celebrated with his playmates at the White House on Tuesday, and the next day, Caroline was to have been the star of a big family birthday party up at Cape Cod. And all of the Kennedys have been planning to get together for their traditional Thanksgiving gathering at Hyannisport on Thursday. For the two Kennedy children and for the entire family, of course, Mr. Kennedy's death today was the second family tragedy about which they had to be told this year. The first, the death in the case of the children of their infant brother, Patrick Beauvoir Kennedy, last August the 9th. To recapitulate where some of the other principals in today's tragedy are at this hour, the Kennedy family, as we have said, gathering in Hyannisport. President Lyndon Baines Johnson, at 54, by ascension now the 36th President of the United States, is working, as George Herman told you a moment ago, in the Executive Office Building across the street from the White House. Mrs. Lyndon Johnson is at their home in Washington. The two Johnson children, daughters, one is at school in Washington, the other was at Austin, Texas, planning to be a part of the weekend on the LBJ Ranch outside of Austin, at which President and Mrs. Kennedy were to have been the honored guests. Whether they are going to fly now to Washington is not known at this hour. And the body of the late President John Fitzgerald Kennedy lies at the U.S. Naval Hospital at Bethesda, Maryland. The body will be taken back to the White House to lie in state at the White House tomorrow. On Sunday, it will be taken to the Capitol building to remain in the Great Rotunda until noon on Monday. It is understood at the moment that the actual funeral services, which will be a full-dress state ceremony, will be held in Boston, but a funeral mass will be said in Washington by Cardinal Cushing, who married the Mr. and Mrs. Kennedy a couple of years ago. Down in Dallas, Texas, one other individual who may have been a principal in this tragedy today, the man whom the police say is a prime suspect. Lee Oswald, a member of the Free Cuba Committee, a man who went to Russia and attempted to take up citizenship there in 1959 and returned here only last year, has been booked for the murder of a Dallas policeman shot in the Texas Theater 3 miles from the site on the Dallas Street where President Kennedy was assassinated and Governor Connally was shot, seized some 45 minutes later in a gunfight after the teller at the theater said that a man who looked like he was running from something had come into the theater. He was interrogated for more than 6 hours this afternoon. He has been booked now for the murder of the policeman, but there has been no charge leveled regarding the murder of the President of the United States. In case he or the culprit is found and charged, it is a simple murder charge in the state of Texas. It is not a federal offense, and he would face electrocution by the laws of the state of Texas in the Huntsville, Texas State Penitentiary. We are going to continue our coverage of this tragic day in a moment with special broadcasts recounting the career of the late president and a visit with the man who succeeded him. This is Walter Cronkite.